Hi everyone, my name is Ellen. I'm a consultant at the Information Lab, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about dashboard design. At the Information Lab there's one session that I've been wrangled into teaching, and that's the basics of designing dashboards. In this session we take a look at some of the fundamentals of design, then we take a look at an example dashboard that I feel could be improved, and I go over the ways that I kind of address each one of these issues and why. And this session that I teach kind of forms a foundation of this video today. So we'll be looking at the fundamentals of good design, we'll be taking a look at my bad example, we'll see what's wrong with it, how we can improve it, and then we'll apply these changes. So this is quite a sort of oversimplified set of 4 factors which I feel contribute to a good dashboard, that being colour, consistency, whitespace and containers, and communication. And as we go through each one of these, I'll show a few good examples, and then we'll take our bad example dashboard and see how it has pitfalls in each of these 4 different categories. But before we kind of dig into these in too much detail, we're going to take a quick look at my bad example. Okay, so switching to Tableau so we can take a look at this bad example. And kind of a note on this bad dashboard, I'm using air quotes as the dashboard isn't terrible. It's perfectly fine, it gets the job done. I didn't want to be kind of facetious and make something completely minging. I wanted to show something that's, it's all right, and it's heavily based on a particular dashboard that I've seen at work. I just wanted to show how I'd kind of elevate a dashboard that's, half decent and change it into something a bit nicer. So the aim of this dashboard, it's pretty simple. It's Superstore sales, so something we're all familiar with. And in this dashboard, you can pick a state in the sort of parameter section at the top. And then you can also choose a metric here. You see this metric, the metrics that we have in the parameter. We've got our sales, our profit, and our orders. And these are the exact same metrics that we see here in these bands at the top. And then we have sort of 5 different bar charts underneath. All of these bar charts sort of filter each other, so we can kind of filter our other things by sort of a particular segment or so on. However, each one of these bar charts is divided up, and also you can, alongside selecting your state here in the drop down, you can also use this sort of bar chart here to change the current state that you're looking at. So it's pretty simple, and again I'll go into, as we look at our kind of 4 fundamental categories, I'll show how I feel that this dashboard kind of lacks in these sort of 4 certain categories, and kind of contextualize those fundamentals a little bit in terms of what this dashboard is doing wrong. So jumping back into our fundamentals of the design, we see we've got 4 different ones here. We've got color, consistency, white space and containers, and communication. So the first fundamental I'm going to go into detail on is color. I'm usually harping on about color quite a lot, as I feel it's not often used kind of, to the best that it can be. So the main points here is that you want to use color sparingly. For the main body of your dashboard, I think that you should be using something that's really muted with low saturation, something like a grey or a stone, a pastel, or just a really low opacity version of your corporate color scheme. So the point is to sort of stay away from that really saturated color. Super saturated colors can, often cause eye strain due to the retina becoming overstimulated, and you'll generally find that they're a bit unpleasant to look at. Sort of when there's quite a lot of, when there's big blocks of these saturated colors. Similarly, I find large quantities of dark color to be quite overpowering, and they often detract from visualization rather than enhance it. And also when I'm talking about these dark colors, I don't necessarily mean the whole like dark mode thing that you often get with dashboards, although those often aren't ideal. I'm talking about high contrast. So a super light colored dashboard that has a load of jet black bars all over it. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. So you really want to sort of do your best to reserve those dark and saturated colors for the most important bits of information you have in your dashboard, like like using a bright red, for example, to highlight your profit going below 0. And in the topic of being sparing, also only use color when you need it. So when I've been working with a few clients, I'll often see a bar chart that's broken down by a given dimension, and then that dimension will be thrown on color. But this color doesn't necessarily sort of provide any additional information or insight. It's just kind of been added for the sake of it. And then in turn, doing that, we're just adding in sort of unnecessary visual clutter. So for some examples that I think are good in terms of the sort of using color, these are a few examples that I have here. So on the sort of left-hand side here, we have a dashboard that I've sort of built previously that you can find on my Tableau Public, that was made as a sort of demonstration for dashboards that look at the supply chain in particular. And this is what I mean about sort of using sort of the main color of your dashboard should be something that's quite muted. So the main color that I've got here for all my bars is kind of light gray color. Then I've got some bright colors in the for positive and negative, this purple and the green, to sort of highlight when metrics aren't doing too well or they're doing well. And then I've got a couple of highlight shades in here as well, using this pink and this sort of really dark shade to highlight the particular product that we're looking at. So that's kind of like a nice example, I think, of like a color scheme that is largely quite muted and quite subtle, but sort of leaning on those bright colors to pick out key bits of information. And then what I've got on the right hand side here is kind of what I'm on about in terms of just sort of watching out for using those super saturated colors. So say that you had a corporate color scheme that kind of had these really bright blues and reds in them. It can be, this is what I mean about the sort of overstimulating of the retina. I personally find this bar chart quite tough to look at with sort of how bright and saturated that the colors are. So if you had to use colors like this because of your corporate color palette, or they were just colors that you fancied using, I find something like this below option here, where they've been the bars have been super washed out and they just have the kind of bright colors right at the end highlighting the direction of the bar, is kind of how I'd approach using those really bright saturated colors in terms of they're present enough to really draw your attention to the important bits of information, that being sort of positive and negative values, but they're not too overwhelming. So I think it's a nice example of how you can use colors that are really saturated in a way that's much easier on the eye. So what we're going to look at next is how I feel that my bad example dashboard kind of fits into this category, and how it has pitfalls in the terms of the way that it uses color. So I feel that this sort of bad demo dashboard I have both uses color too much and too sparingly. In the ways I think it uses color too much is that it uses a really dark color for all of our charts. So all of these bar charts that we have, they're using this, really kind of dark, almost blue-black color. And I find that personally quite difficult to look at, particularly when we have a lot of these bars, like in our product by sales, our manufacturer by sales. It kind of creates almost like a barcode effect on the eye, which I don't particularly like, and I find just kind of unpleasant, pleasant to look at overall. And there's also a personal pet hate of mine, is that it uses a big sort of dark block of text to highlight this sort of top container where we've got our title and our bands at the top of the dashboard. I don't like doing this because when you use a really dark or bright color, they're going to sort of, whatever naturally has the most contrast to the rest of the dashboard is going to be where the eye sort of naturally veers. So I don't really know why I'd want to make this container really, really dark, because what the effect that this personally has for me is that it's kind of drawing my eye away from the bands. The bands is obviously what we want to look at. We want to see how it's sort of the values have changed from, say, the previous month or the previous year, which is what our bands include. But instead of kind of drawing my eye to these big numbers, these sort of immediate insights that we want to glean from just taking a quick glance at our dashboard, instead my eye is just kind of drawn to this empty dark space. So essentially in this dashboard we're using the darkest and the sort of most obvious color to highlight just dead space on a dashboard that doesn't offer us any data points, doesn't offer us any insight. So I don't like to use color in this particular way. I also don't think that, this big block of color particularly looks good. So I don't find this as like a good example of when, it's worth impinging on the legibility of a dashboard to, make the design look a bit better. Yeah, I kind of don't think it's worth that sort of, balancing of those two things. So that's something that I don't like to sort of do and employ in my dashboards. I like to keep all of my sort of containers and all of these sections sort of nice and light, and yeah, reserve those colors for the key bits of information that we want to look at. And for example, I mentioned in the dashboard as well that we're able to choose the state that we're looking at by kind of, using this bar chart that we have on the far left. And if I wanted to, make it really clear and kind of pick out which particular state was selected. So in this example, North Carolina, which is this little bar here. I'd have to, make that bar a really, really bright color to, kind of make it stand out against the really, really dark bars that we've used already. So I personally just, like to opt to use something a little bit lighter for these sort of, main bodies of information. And in terms of how this dashboard uses sort of color too sparingly, in my opinion, is sort of back on this bar chart here. Like I said, it'd be really nice, I think, to highlight in this state by sales section which state was chosen. And this dashboard doesn't do that. It doesn't do that at the moment. So I think that would be a nice thing to be included. That would just make the dashboard sort of more legible and easy to understand. And another thing that I don't like about this dashboard is that I think that I mentioned the bands previously, they have a little number which says what these values were compared to the previous year. And when it's a positive change, the numbers just they're a very similar color to the rest of the dashboard, so they don't pop out enough, in my opinion. The negative one kind of pops out quite nicely, and that is red. But I think those positive values, should be changed so we can sort of more readily pick out that positive change. The next fundamental that we're going to look at is consistency. So this one's pretty self-explanatory, so I haven't included any sort of good examples of how to employ this one. But as you can probably guess, the main point is just to keep things consistent. So what I mean by this is that all of your titles have one size and one color, all of your subtitles have one size and one color, all of your text is one size and one color, and so on and so forth. And this applies to, not just text, but also the use of color, the use of containers, the use of padding, and anything that kind of, helps create a theme for your work. You don't want to jump around between charts and dashboards and, have a kind of different look and feel for each one. You want that a cohesive theme throughout your work. And I feel that this dashboard, as you can probably guess, has some pitfalls in terms of this sort of consistency element. So in terms of the text alignment, this is another bit of kind of a little pet hate of mine. The text is both right, left, and center aligned. I personally like to have everything sort of aligned in one direction, which is typically left, and then I'll sometimes, deviate to something else for titles or when I think it kind of looks good and works with the design. But I like to kind of keep things consistent in that area. The padding is also inconsistent. It differs between charts and isn't congruent across all of them, and there also just more generally isn't enough sort of padding, in my opinion, anywhere on this dashboard. And one inconsistency that I think really messes up the way that this dashboard looks and just kind of looks quite unpleasant is the way that we have sort of three nice bands at the top of the dashboard, and then the containers underneath that we have for each one of our bar charts, or each sort of one of our bar charts here and pairs of our other two dashboards, they don't align with our bands at the top. I think it looked much more pleasant if, our state by sales sort of ended here, then our segment and our manufacturer one finished here, and then we had our, other two at the end. I think if these all sort of fit together nicely, it would look much more sort of pleasing as just a quick cursory glance at the dashboard. So that's one of the kind of main things I'd pick quite off the bat. This next one, again, quite a lot of these points seem a little bit pedantic, but I think they do kind of, generally come together to make things look much more pleasant. I really don't like it when bar charts or, bars aren't the same size. So in this particular example, particularly our sort of, these three here. All the bars are all quite sort of thin and kind of, narrow and have quite a lot of spacing between them. Whereas our kind of segment by sales here only has 3 bars, and these are taking up the whole space. So they're sort of much larger, and it doesn't really fit with the others. And our state by sales doesn't match with the general theme either. I would think it would look much better if these were all just fit width, and they were all sort of the same spacing, all the bars were the same size. I think, yeah, that would look much more cohesive. And another thing I always like to try and ensure that I do with my dashboards, or when I've kind of got things stacked on top of one another, is that I like it when the start position of all my bars are in the same place. So similarly to the sort of sizes of the bars, we can see with our product by sales here, the start of the bar is over here. Then for our manufacturer one, it's much further along. And if these were all kind of consistent and lined up nicely, I think it would just make the dashboard look a lot neater and a lot cleaner. So there's a few elements of consistency here, which I think just throws off the general look of the dashboard. So next one that we have here, our next fundamental, is containers and whitespace. Essentially for me, this pretty much means just adding loads of padding to everything, giving everything a lot of breathing room, and using containers to separate and bucket information in a way that helps the dashboard flow, and also just employing containers in a way that makes the dashboard look a lot nicer. So I've got a few good examples for this one on the next slide. So again, this is another kind of couple example from my Tableau Public of how I kind of like to utilize containers. I'm a bit of a one-trick pony when it comes to making dashboards. Really, I like to use containers I like to kind of layer them as well, not just use them sort of singularly. And I like to use them to separate content, highlight key information, encode color, and generally make things look pleasant. And I like to do this with usually really low opacity shades. So that we have in a few examples here, using containers, various different ones to sort of create this nice look and feel and tie these bits of information together, and also make it really easy for people to look at this KPI that we have here, see how it goes over time, see the sort of top performers in this area, and kind of work your way across and down the dashboard in kind of like a Z pattern. And similarly with these ones that we have here, just using them to encode color nicely and help just making it easier for the user to kind of pick out those bits of information and associate them with various different things across the dashboards. And I think, yeah, using containers is a really good way to do this. And if you kind of finesse them enough, I personally feel that you don't have to go into Figma or use like additional software or anything like that. I always just stick to using purely Tableau in all of the dashboards that I do. I try not lean on other software too much, and just use containers to really help sort of box information up and make it look a lot nicer. So in terms of our bad example, I've already mentioned how I don't like sort of the alignment of the containers between each of the dashboard elements, and I've also noted that I think the coloring of some of these containers is sort of far too dark for my liking, so I'll leave those for now. But yeah, another thing that I think that I don't think this dashboard does well enough is utilizing padding. So I don't think that this dashboard has enough padding really anywhere on the dashboard. I don't like, how close that these bars and these bits of text are to the outside border for each of the containers. And I also don't like how close the containers are to each other generally. So these are all things that I would, fix quite immediately. So the last fundamental for us to look at is communication. So this one, the kind of main point on this is just to let users know what they're seeing, let users know what's interactive, and just make the dashboard as sort of easy to garner information from as possible. Sort of really pick out those important bits of information. And this I've kind of put last because the use of color, consistency, and white space and containers really helps make a dashboard sort of as communicable as possible. And I've got a couple of examples of how I like to try and make my dashboards as easy to understand as I can. So these are my examples here and the things that I always like to try and include. So first off, I always like to have, a clear sort of space where I put all of my filters, all of my parameters, all the things that the user can use to interact with the dashboard. Always like a clear space to have these. I typically do these in the sort of left-hand corner or at the top of a dashboard. And in these sections, I always like to include like a click action or a URL action, a hover action, whatever it may be. I always like to do like a little key for where this interactivity lies, and I generally mark this with like quite a bright colored triangle. So I'll just put in a little key for something like this, and then whenever a element of a dashboard has that sort of interactivity present, I'll include the arrow in sort of the title of that particular chart element. And what I have highlighted in the second example is I always like to try and make my titles as sort of informative as possible. So, clear title just stating what that particular chart element does, but also like we can see in this example, I've encoded color into it just to, make it kind of as clear to the user as I can what exactly is going on. So you can see in the title, I've shown it's green for positive trend, purple for negative trend. I've also got a little section to highlight what that kind of pink background means for one of the individuals that we have here, and it means that client is selected. So that particular chart will filter another element of the dashboard, and I've tried to make it as clear as possible what each of those various different colors mean, and I like to include that in the title rather than just a little like legend that's off to the side or something. I think it's quite handy to include things as sort of close to the dashboard element as I can to just make users aware of what's going on. And what I have in this third example here is another thing I like to try and do is when I've got a lot of different KPIs, particularly when often when you're working with various different KPIs, say you're working in insurance or something, you'll often find that you're working with like a litany of different ratios, and some of them when they go up it's good, sometimes when they go up it's bad. And when you're dealing with things like this, I find it's nice to kind of put little coloured arrows in the title to indicate what it means when a value goes up or down, just to help make it clear to the user, and they don't have to think about the metric too much and what those colors particularly mean. It's nice just have it in the title so that the user doesn't really have to think that much. It's right there for them. So jumping back to our bad example and how I feel this doesn't I feel like it could be sort of communicate things to the user and in ways that are kind of simpler and more effective. I mentioned earlier when I was looking at the dashboard that this sort of state by sales bar chart that we have here, this can be used to select an individual state. There's only one state selected at any given time on this dashboard, and whilst we have it included in the title here, I think it'd be really nice if this bar chart had that visible, so that North Carolina, for example, our state here, if that was made really clear that this was the state that was currently selected. So yeah, I'd try and make it clearer which state was selected, and I'd also try and make it clearer which metric was selected, and that's in two different ways. So um, as we can see, it says like state by sales, we've got segment by sales. I think that perhaps that metric should be bolder in the title to make it clear to the user. And I also think it would be nice, given that each of the metrics that we have shown or that we're able to show are sales, profit, and orders. We have them here in these three bands. I think it would be nice to sort of tether that a bit more to our chart. So perhaps perhaps the bar will change color with the whichever measure is selected, so we can kind of tie it along with the bands at the top. I think would be a nice addition. And also all of these sheets are able to filter each other, and that isn't made readily clear to the user. So like that thing that I mentioned before with adding in the little colored triangles so your users know what's filterable, I think those would be really handy on these sort of 5 charts that we have here. Okay, so now we've gone through all of those 4 different sort of fundamental categories, and we've looked at this bad example in the context of each of those. Now we know which points we can kind of pick out to improve and make this dashboard look a little bit better. So for this next bit, I'm going to be jumping into Tableau and implementing some of those changes and talking through them as I go, so you can kind of see how I would approach redesigning something like this. So for the first bit, and where I'm going to start off, is kind of changing the change the color of the kind of main dashboard and getting rid of some of these dark components that I don't like. So I'm going to jump into Tableau and get rid of them now. So for this first bit, I'm going to get rid of the color of this container that I don't particularly like. So I'm going to jump into here and get rid of the background on this and also on this one here. A little bit tricky to find out which container is bringing the color in. And I'm going to just make this title darker so I don't lose it when I'm building things. So when I make dashboards, I generally like to make them a little bit darker. I don't like to leave them as that sort of stark white. And I also like to change the color of the container rather than the main dashboard itself. That's just because I quite like it when it renders, when you go full screen, you don't kind of color the background in the same color as the dashboard. So I'm just going to take that out padding off. I'm going to change it to a light grey. When you have sort of really dark text on a pure white background, that really, really high contrast can make it difficult for certain users, particularly users that have things like dyslexia and so on. That really high contrast can sort of create a glare and people can find it difficult to read. So that's why I like to always do a slight pastel background, or something that's sort of, a light grey or a stone. And I also like to throw a border on my widest container because if I'm doing something light grey, it can be a little bit difficult to see where your canvas sort of starts, and in case it merges into the side of of your canvas. So I like to add a little border in so I can see sort of the space that I'm working with more clearly. So we've gotten rid of that dark container. Now I'm going to just get rid of all the dark borders on my bars and start sorting out these bar charts. Because I mentioned earlier, there's quite a few things about these bar charts I don't like. One of those things being all of the, I don't feel like there's enough padding between the sort of these individual bar charts, and I don't think there's enough padding on the inside. So I'm going to switch everything to 10 on the outside and 10 on the inside and see if that makes everything look a little bit better and gives a little more breathing room, and also just, yeah, make those containers lighter because I don't like how dark they are. So a few of these steps will be quite repetitive. But yeah, I think it will kind of make everything look a lot better. And also the padding for these, you can probably see the numbers that I'm changing. A lot of them had sort of, different paddings on. And like we noted, we want everything to be consistent. So changing everything from an outer padding and my inner padding to a 10. Okay. So another thing I didn't like about the bar charts is I didn't like how all of the sizing was different for all of these bars. So that's my next step, is to make the sizing a little more consistent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make all of my bars sort of the maximum width. I'm going to throw on a white border. So that kind of, gives them a little bit of a gap. That means I'll kind of have to play around with the sizing less, because once you've sized your bars and you kind of go back to try and change them, it can be a little bit faffy to try and get the size the same. So if you just make the maximum width and throw a border on, you don't really have to worry about matching that up. So that's what I'm going to do with all of these. Go through them as quickly as possible. And finally, for my state and profit one. Okay. I'm also going to change this from profit to sales so I can see the starting point a little clearly, so we don't have those negative values. Okay, so next thing I didn't like about the bars is that they're all different widths. So now I'm going to have to try and size these to a similar width across all of them, which is going to be, again, a little bit faffy. So if I've just made this fit width instead of entire view, this means that things will kind of filter down a little bit more nicely. And so that means I'm going to fit everything else width, and I'm going to try and match them up a little bit. I'm kind of doing this just sort of with my eye at the moment. If I was taking more time to do this and I went to make it sort of ensure it was more consistent, I'd maybe throw the grid on that you can do in Tableau and then kind of line them up that way. But for now, I'm just gonna kind of do it with my eye and hope that I get something that kind of matches across them. And then finally, for my state by sales, gonna make that a bit skinnier. I'm gonna bring this one in a little bit as well. Okay, fab. So I think those look a little more consistent now. Maybe make my state a little bit wider. Okay. So now my bars are a little more consistent. One thing that I did want to do that I noted as well was that I really don't like how the alignment isn't consistent across all of these. So we can see that this is right aligned for this one, but all my text is left aligned for this one. I really like to have left aligned. I quite like, kind of how when it's left aligned, I like how this kind of tessellates with the container next to it. And I think it just looks much cleaner. So that means I'm going to left align all of these, which actually will be better to do in the individual sheet so I don't have to deal with the filter actions that are currently going on my dashboard. So I'll just jump in and do that quickly. And then finally for my manufacturer one here, and make that left aligned. Okay, fab. So one of the other things that annoyed me about these bar charts is that they don't tessellate to the sort of bands that we have at the top. And that's a quick and simple fix because I can just go to this wider container and I can select to distribute my contents evenly. And that's what I have on the top here. And as we can see, that's now kind of aligned these nicely. So now I've got like a nice little cross as my crotch section here. I mean, haven't got that looking a little sort of odd and misaligned they looked before. So I think this already looks, quite a bit better in my opinion. But one of the other things that I wanted to change is I wanted my bar start positions to be all in the same place. So as we can see that we've got our product by sale starts here, but our manufacturer starts all the way over here. And part of the issue with this is that our manufacturer has sort of longer names. So in order to not, get those dotted lines to concatenate, we kind of need a shorter bar and kind of more space for the text, which we don't need for our product by sales. But going through this, I can see that, this is quite short text, this is quite short text, but our customers have got some quite long names as well. So that means I'm going to shift these around a little bit because this customer by sales and the manufacturer, because they're both quite long in text, they're both going to have sort of shorter bars and larger text spaces. So I think they look better sat on top of each other and having a sort of larger starting point than those other two bars. So I'm going to shift my customer over here and I'm going to throw my product by sales here. And then we can see they've already kind of lined up for us there. I don't think there's anything for us to change. I'm going to leave those as is. So now these all have a similar starting point. So that looks nice there. That looks nice there. And our state is fine as well because District of Columbia is that's just visible, and that's the longest state name that we have. So I already think that makes everything look a lot neater and simpler already with those few changes. Okay, so one of the next things I wanted to change that I noted earlier on in the presentation is that I'd quite like it because our metric parameter, because it has sales, profit, and orders, because that matches these three bands that we have here. I think it'd be quite nice that, when sales was selected, we kind of had a color on sales here, and then we could have that on each one of our bars. So, it's much clearer which metric is selected and how that ties to the KPI at the top. So what that means is I'm just going to place my measure names on each one of these bar charts, just to make that metric selection a little bit clearer. So to do this, I'm just going to jump into each one of my sheets and I'm going to throw my metric parameter on as a color for each of these bar charts. I've got my color in already and I've just done some sort of quite random pastel shades for this. Obviously this would kind of maybe tessellate with your corporate colors or whatever colors that you fancy, but preferably something that would be colorblind friendly would be a good choice. And I'm going with something that's quite light and easy to look at because I don't love using those really dark bars which I mentioned earlier. So now, because we've got that sort of metric parameter on our colors, now when we switch to sales, when we switch to profit, and we switch to orders, these are now going to sort of change color alongside them. But what that means is for our KPIs up here, we now need to sort of associate that color with each one of our KPIs. So that's going to be our next step. Just before we do that though, I've got a few changes that I want to make here. Like I said, I like all of my, generally try and like all of my text to be quite consistent. So I'm going to change these to title case instead of all caps. Ooh. And I'm going to make them left aligned to kind of match the rest of the text that I have here. And I'm also going to do that to each of the KPIs that I have here. So instead of center, I'm just going to make these all left, and then I can get along with changing the color for these. Okay. And then just the last one that we have here. This is always quite an annoying little bug that I always find happens in Tableau when I'm doing things like this. And I just change it back to standard and entire view if that gets cut off like it did there. Okay, now these are all nice and left aligned. Like I said, what I'm going to do is so for example, for orders, I kind of want this container for orders to be blue at the top. And then when we change it to profit and so on, I'd like these to be, I'd like my profit one to be pink and my sales one to be green. Okay, so quite handily, I've got all my, because I've been using these colors quite recently, they're just going to populate here for me. And these are quite light already, so I'm just going to switch them to 50% opacity for all of these. And I'm also going to throw on, so I'm going to do it 50% opacity for the main body of the container, maybe change that depending if the colors look a bit too saturated. And then I'm going to throw on the original container as a border, just to give a little nice border to those containers. Okay. I'll throw that on as a border there. One of the next things I quite like to do is, because we've got these bands here, look at the sales versus the previous year. So we can see that for our Washington state that we've got selected at the moment, they've had an increase in sales. And when I do sort of, previous year values like this, I often like to have a little bit of a time trend to just kind of contextualize those numbers a little bit. And I've got some kind of cheat sheets that I've got built here, which, kind of a little time trend of those particular values. So I'm also going to add these into each one of these sort of little bands that we have at the top. So to do that, I'm just going to grab in a container. I'm going to fix this container because it can be a bit finicky if you don't fix the size initially when you're adding some new sheets in. And I'm going to throw in a blank. Then I'm going to throw in another container. And then I'm just going to put my main value in there and then just that number underneath. Then I'm going to go in and unfix that, and I'm going to grab in my sales time trend, delete that blank, and then just sort of drag this over until I get like a nice, there we go, until those hashtags disappear. And then these can just have a little bit of padding. So I don't think that time trend's got enough padding, so I'm just going to throw on 10 for the outer padding for this. And then generally, I think this container could do with a bit of inner padding anyway. So I'm going to throw on another 7. And I think that looks a little bit nicer. So I'll quickly do that for the profit and orders, so you don't have to kind of watch me go through those containers again. And those are now all done for us there. So I think those time trends, help to contextualize things a little bit. I often like to just add in like an area chart which highlights the current bit of period of time that we're looking at, so we can quite clearly see on this sales one that this is the current year that we're looking at here compared to the sort of prior year in the prior section. And you can see, it makes sense that we're kind of above 230% here in terms of increase. And now I think that kind of tessellates quite nicely. Someone can immediately see that we're changing through sales, we're changing through profit, and we're changing through orders here. I also emboldened the text that we have here for our bands and our metrics. This is what I mean when I say, we want to save those really dark colors for those most important bits of information. So we're going to want our users to immediately be able to see these bands here. That's why we have these, big numbers, is to just immediately draw the eye. And by using sort of bold and dark text here, and then using light colors for all our bars and so on, it just makes that information really stand out. There was another little bit that I wanted to do, is that I'm going to go through and change all of these to bold to, again, make that a little bit clearer, that we're looking at each of these things by that given metric. So I'll go through and do that in a second. And another thing I wanted to do, and another thing that I felt was kind of lacking in terms of color for this dashboard is, let me pick a better, is there a better state that I can choose? Is that when there's a negative value, when there's a positive value, the colors don't go, the colors aren't that clear, but when there's a negative value, the numbers are bright red. So it's quite easy to see when profit goes down, but it's not as easy to see when our profits going up. They go high is a good one. So the blue, that positive change just kind of blends into the rest of the dashboard. So I'm going to go through and also change the colors of these negative and positive values to something that I think stands out a bit more for both of those values. So there's the changes I'm going to go through and do next. Okay, so I've kind of emboldened each of the dimensions that are included in each of the bar charts, so we kind of can see much more easily and pick out much more easily what each of these measures is kind of being split against. So I think that makes it a lot clearer. And also for these up here, the bands that we have up the top, I've changed the color so that a positive value sticks out much more by using this bright purple. And I've also gone through and added sort of year on year to the sort of the preface for each one of these values, because whilst we got the line chart in for additional bit of context, I didn't think it was massively clear that these are looking at the previous year rather than the previous month, for example. So I think that's a helpful addition. Another thing I quite like to add, again, it's not really necessary for this particular dashboard, but a practice I like to do if, like I said earlier in the presentation, if you're working with a lot of different ratios and it's good when some go up and some go down, I like to add a little bit, I like to add a sort of a little key into the KPI title, just so users know kind of exactly what it means for each one. They don't really have to think about what those colors mean. It's right there in the text for them. So because all of these are kind of good if they go up, it's not hugely necessary, but in a different context, I think that would be helpful. Another bit of color that I'd like to add, again, something that I went through earlier, is that whilst we can, we've kind of sorted out the bit where we can like pick our different metric and change the colors that way. But what I'd also like to do is pick out which state is highlighted at the time. So at the moment, we've got Ohio selected. But if we, switch to Michigan, I'd like it to be clear on this particular bar chart that that's the state that we're looking at. So for that, I've just got a quick calculated field that is simple, just, says if our state matches what's in the state parameter, then selected, else our metric parameter. And what this does when we throw it on color, you can see that we've now got a darker bar that highlights the state that we have chosen. And then all of the other bars will kind of, match the metric that we have. And I think that just makes it, a lot clearer that we're looking at these sort of, whichever given state that we're looking at. And a bit that I would also add, just to kind of, help it hit home a little bit, because it's, helpful to have it sort of really there in the title and the chart and have those informative titles, is that I would just, let the user know the selected state is the one that we have here, and I'd make that a bit smaller, and I'd also kind of make it match the color that we have here, so something like that. And then also just embolden that a little, just again hit home that that's the state that we have selected. So I think that's a kind of helpful little addition that we could throw in there. So another thing that I'd like to do is to this dashboard, which is kind of requires restructuring it a little, is that I don't tend to kind of love having sort of my title and all my filters and stuff across the top of a dashboard. When you're in like a business setting, you usually find that you're not just having one or two filters. You usually got quite a lot on the dashboard. And I don't love having those sort of show and hide containers because they're not hugely intuitive if users aren't really familiar with using dashboards on your Tableau server or Tableau Online instance or whatever you're using. So I generally like to put stuff on the left-hand side. So what I think would be nice if we had sort of a left, almost like control or settings panel where we have our title, where we have our parameters, and where we can add some sort of keys and so on and so forth. So that is what I'm going to add in now. So to do that, I'm just going to add in a container, and I'm going to fix that for now just to make it easier to move stuff around. I'm going to throw in a blank. And then I'm going to throw in a horizontal container. And this horizontal container is going to make up our control panel. I'm going to make that a little bit darker because I often like to just change the shade of those a little bit. And then I'm going to drag these 3 elements in. So we've got our 1, 2, and 3. And then into this space, I'm going to grab this container that has all of our sort of dashboard elements in it. And I'm just going to throw that in there. Delete that kind of placeholder blank that we had to make everything easier to move around. And then let me just grab that wider container and unfix the height. So that'll look like so. And then another thing that I'm going to do, see, get myself into a maze of containers, is to add some inner padding to these. So not so close to the side, which I think looks a little bit nicer. And then I'm going to make this container a bit skinnier because our control panel doesn't need to be that big. I'll make that, say, 175 would be a bit better. And the bonus of putting this down here is that because, we've kind of got a lot of bar charts that we can scroll through and look at the values. And by putting our control panel over here, we're kind of keeping our dashboard a nice sort of size for users to view, but we're also maximizing sort of the sort of horizontal, sorry, not horizontal, the vertical space that we have. So, our bars aren't as cramped and we can see as many values as possible. So then we just got a little bit of formatting to do. On the inside of our control panel, let's throw 10 on. I'm going to format my text object so it sits nicely at the top. And then I'm just going to add some sort of padding and change my text a little bit to make that look a little bit nicer. Okay, so now we're back. Now I've kind of, fixed up this control panel that we have here. I've center aligned some things. I've made the title bold. I've made this sort of match the color that we have here to show the state selected. I like to kind of put in this little settings panel to let people know this is kind of where you go for your filters. And I've also changed the parameters to have some more intuitive titles like select a metric and select a state, so the users can kind of more immediately aware of what these different drop downs do. I've also added in this little bit of text here which says click action, and you can see it's got a little yellow arrow next to it. Like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, I usually like to, when my charts are interactive like these are, I like to let the user more, be aware of that. And sometimes, I could write under these all of this as like a subtitle, click to filter view, but instead of doing that, it can be a bit sort of repetitive to do that kind of thing. So I'm just going to add a triangle to each one of my charts that are filterable and throw these all in. Another thing that we could potentially do to make this dashboard a little more clearer and a little more interactive, I think rather than having this sort of metric just as a drop down would be to kind of create a sheet that we could click on that was also color encoded, and would let users to do this in a more interactive way. And I've got a sheet already pre-built for this. But whilst, I think this is a nice to have, I don't think it's hugely necessary in kind of benefiting the user experience. So it's not a hugely necessary step. But for this particular sheet, I could set up a parameter action, and then rather than having to change it in the drop down, users could, click on sales, click on profit, click on orders, and change the values that way. But I'm not going to set up the parameter action for now. But that's kind of a thing that I quite like to do if I'm using particular values like this in the dashboards I'm creating. So that's it for the redesign. I think we kind of improved quite a lot of elements of the dashboard, and it looks quite a lot better as the end of the result, in my opinion. And that's the end of the redesign, so it's the end of our video. I hope it gave you some insight into how I approach dashboard design, and hopefully you also picked up some tips along the way. So thank you for watching.